Once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today, Best Practices in Employee Offboarding. We're right at 3 p.m. Central Time, which is where we're located in Nashville, Tennessee. So I'm going to give it just about another 30 seconds before we get started. So if everyone can just hang on the line for a minute. All right, well, let's get started. So my name is Danny Nelms. I'm the president of Work Institute, but I like to think of myself more as an HR junkie than a person who runs a workforce research company. But I'm really excited to be joining you today. Obviously, we debated for days about whether to continue with our webinar. Obviously, we are living in extraordinary times right now. The coronavirus outbreak is affecting every single person's life right now, and we know that there are so many that are having a difficult time. And so first and foremost, we just want to share our thoughts and prayers to any of those that are affected with obviously the illness, but then just everyone that's being affected by this in general. We're really thinking about you. Hope that this passes quickly and that we can all get back to some sort of normalcy, but really just want to put that out there first and foremost. But, you know, some things have to move on and go on, and so we just felt like maybe you needed a few minutes to get your thoughts into something else and maybe learn a little bit about the offboarding process. So we decided to move forward and go ahead and have our webinar today. I do want to let everybody know that you are muted, so I cannot hear anyone, but we invite you to ask questions via the question box in your Zoom webinar link. So look forward to those, and we'll certainly be answering them as much as I can as we go along. And I want to mention that at the end, I'm more than happy to open up the questions to anything related to workplace issues that might be going on today. I'm certainly not going to profess to be an HR legal expert, but I know that, you know, so many things are happening right now from the standpoint of the impacts of the coronavirus and this health crisis on our workplaces, that I'd certainly be more than welcome to try and answer any and all of those questions that might come up, especially at the end of our webinar. So, you know, what is it about, you know, the offboarding process? And, you know, one of the things that we talk about a lot is onboarding. And, you know, onboarding gets a lot of publicity. It gets a lot of noise. It's such an important part of the first few days and weeks and months of an employee joining the organization. And a lot of times we don't give enough emphasis to the offboarding process. And, you know, it's not difficult, the process and procedures that take place when an employee leaves the organization. And certainly we hope we have fewer than more folks that are actually leaving our organization. But it's important that we do have a good process in place, that we manage the overall employee experience at the end of the employee life cycle. It's such a critical time. It's sometimes a difficult time for employees. Even if they're leaving under positive circumstances, many employees have spent years and years with an organization. They have friends, they have ties, they have emotions that are tied to their former employer. So you want to make this process of onboarding as positive as it can be. You want to make sure that it reflects well on your brand as a company. So there's just so many important aspects of it. I want to just hit sort of the really high points in terms of some of those objectives of the overall offboarding process. First and foremost is just managing the transition from one employee to the next. I think this is one of the things that we don't always do a great job of, is, you know, how are we going to make sure that the next person in a job is able to pick that job up and continue to do the work that needs to be done effectively. what is the information they're going to need, what is the training they're going to need, what information does that employee that's leaving might have that is critical to actually completing the role. You know, one of my favorite TV shows is West Wing, and when they were changing all of the members of the White House staff, they did transition documents so that, you know, you could actually know what was important and what was going on at the time, so that you had that smooth transition into the next person into that particular role. So we need to really make sure that we've got good plans related to the offboarding process and what we need to make sure that we do to manage from that person to whoever's the next person in the job. And I know in many instances we're talking about, you know, even things like warehouse workers or truck drivers or any number of employees where it might not be sort of an AP clerk where we're sitting in an office and there's certain steps in the process, but almost any job requires that we think about that process and think about the things that are needed in order for that person to transition into the new role. And it's very seldom that we actually get to have those two people meet if in fact they're doing a similar job. So again, documentation is important. The next thing is that there are often legal and compliance issues when the individuals leave. And so whether that be things like non-disclosure agreements, whether there were severance agreements in place, any and all of those legal issues need to be addressed. There's obviously different laws in different states. For example, in California, having to make sure that anybody is paid out any monies owed on their last day. So there's that process that you need to make sure is in place to make sure that you're following all the applicable laws when someone does resign and somebody is going to leave. We want to make sure that we cover all of our bases from a legal and from a compliance standpoint. And we also want to mitigate security risk. So we want to make sure that we do all the things necessary to make sure that once an employee is left, and again, in some cases, maybe it's someone who was leaving involuntarily, maybe it's voluntarily, maybe it's all on good terms, but there is so much emphasis in our world today on IT security in particular that we want to make sure that we're mitigating security risk. And then maybe what people think about the most from the standpoint of the offboarding process is there going to be an opportunity to generate actionable feedback from the former employee on areas to improve the organization? And we typically think about this in terms of an exit interview, but that's just one part of this sort of overall offboarding process when you really think about it. So, you know, what are some of those best practices? And I think what we think about are what are those processes that we need to make sure that we have in place, and making sure that there's someone who has ownership of having developed the appropriate process and knows what needs to be done in each of these elements related to the offboarding process. So one of the first things is, what are the facility concerns? And typically we have either security or someone that's in charge of the overall facility. We have issues like badges that are being issued or codes that are being issued in order to access the workplace. So we have to make sure that anything that is relevant to the facility, that we have processes in place to make sure that we have secured the overall facility so that we don't have any of those concerns going forward. So we need to make sure that there is a very smooth process. And again, in many cases with small employers, you know, that's not that big a deal. We only have to deal with a few people once a month or every other month. But then we have very large employers where we may have literally, you know, 10 or 15 people a day who might be leaving. And again, that may not be high turnover even, but we need to make sure that there is a very, very smooth process in place and that we're covering all of our bases from the standpoint of, are we securing our facility properly? And then next, we have to think about the technology. So almost every employee has to have credentials or logins, anything from email to internal applications to external applications that might be used by an employee. So is there a smooth process in place to make sure that we are eliminating access, removing all passwords, removing all of the access that the employee had from a technology perspective. And again, this gets back to those critical security risk issues that we want to make sure that our technology is always, always secure, and that there's no chance that a former employee is able to access it. And again, when we think about many of the employees we leave, they're leaving on good terms. So we don't think of them necessarily as risk. And I think that there's probably no need to. But then when we have a security audit or a technology audit, then those things get flagged when we're not doing them. Even if there's nobody that's taken advantage of us or done anything wrong or unethical, it still opens the door to the fact that our organization might have a poor process. And if we're not following it routinely, regardless of who the employee is that leaves, then we're leaving ourselves open to potential issues. So we have to really get into good habits and good processes of making sure we have our technology locked down. Again, what are those transition responsibilities? So is the manager going to be responsible for those transition responsibilities? Maybe a coworker's involved. What role does HR play in the transition responsibilities? So we need to make sure that we have someone assigned those responsibilities to make sure that the transition from one employee to the next actually occurs very effectively and easily. So we have to make sure that someone is actually responsible for that. And then, of course, we have all the payroll and legal issues. And, one of the things as an HR professional who was in charge of payroll and HRS for years and years is it seemed like we never were able to get terminations processed timely from a payroll and HRS perspective. So we've got to make sure that we've got some sort of an easy process in place. And I think where this is particularly difficult, and here at the Work Institute, we talk a lot about high people, high facilities. So we have a lot of people in a lot of different places. And this is where some of those challenges really occur, is when you have one facility and everybody is under one roof and HR might be right there or payroll is right there, then it seems to be a little bit easier when you've got someone leaving to take care of those payroll issues when they leave. But when you've got hundreds or thousands of employees scattered across the country or even the world, then we've got to make sure that we have processes in place at those locations where they're either going into a system and notifying payroll of a termination or that they're terminating themselves. Whatever your system is where you're actually managing that process, we need to make sure that we're communicating it effectively and that there is someone responsible at every one of our locations in order to make sure that that happens, because we often have people in payroll that shouldn't have been there. I was doing a little bit of research for this webinar and saw where there was an organization that literally had paid out over a several-year period millions of dollars to people that no longer worked at the company. And it was simply because they weren't timely in how they were processing the terminations, and there was really no way for them to claw that money back. Again, are there legal issues that need to be dealt with? Again, I mentioned earlier non-disclosure agreements. I mentioned the fact that we might have non-competes that we might have to deal with. What are those legal issues, and who's going to be responsible for making sure that each and every employee that leaves, if there are legal issues, that we actually make sure that we cover those in the process of someone leaving the organization. So those are very, very critical. And then there's two aspects, and I think for most organizations, these two things are typically thought of as one, but here at Work Institute, we actually think about these things as two different steps. One is an offboarding interview, and the other is an exit interview. And rather than go into that at this point, I've got a couple of slides that I've built to talk about what each of these steps really is in that process. So I want to talk about the concept or the idea of an offboarding interview. This is an opportunity typically for human resources, but sometimes that manager, to sit down and actually conduct an interview with their employee that's leaving. And I don't necessarily think about this as an exit interview, and I'll get into that a little bit more, but I think of this offboarding interview process as a little bit more informal, a little bit less formal than an exit interview. It's an opportunity to first and foremost thank the employee for their service, thank the employee for their time and their contributions for working for the company. Sometimes I think we forget to do that. And keep in mind that those people that leave are carrying your brand with them. So your employment brand is actually being carried forward from that employee. So they are going to, you know, maybe they had a great time there, but when they left, it just felt like, you know, nobody cared and it wasn't a big issue and it was just a very, you know, a sterile process that they went through, and they just don't feel appreciated when they actually leave. And then what are they then going to say about the company to other friends and colleagues that might be candidates for jobs for the organization? So I think it's always important for HR, the manager, to simply thank the employee for their time and for their contributions for the company. I think it is an opportunity to ask about any significant concerns. Again, I wouldn't qualify this as a formal exit interview, but I think we should give the employee an opportunity to express any concerns that they might have or any opportunities for improvement in the organization at this point. We're going to talk a little bit about what are the pros and cons of conducting an exit interview, but I think in the offboarding interview, it is completely fine to ask these questions, but I don't think it's an opportunity for us to really gather the kind of detailed information that we might want to gather in the more formal exit interview. But I think it's important to ask. I think it's even okay to determine whether we might be able to get this person to stay or not. And more often than not, when I hear people talking about doing exit interviews internally, one of the things that I often hear is they say, well, if I were to do that exit interview after they've left, or I do it with an external third party, I don't get a chance to see if I can get them to stay. And that's where, I differentiate the offboarding interview with the exit interview itself, because in this offboarding interview, there's an opportunity to see if there is something that could change. Is there something the organization can do that might compel that employee to actually stay with the organization? Maybe they wanted to be transferred to another department and we didn't really realize it, or it got tied up in red tape or bureaucracy. So what is it that we might be able to do in order to get that employee to stay with the organization? Maybe it's too late, maybe it's not, but certainly it's an opportunity to find out if we can get the employee to stay, especially in the environment that we have here in the U.S. right now related to employment. Now, this is coronavirus and the health issues notwithstanding. You know, a week and a half ago, we had 3.5% unemployment. We had 7.5 million open jobs. So, you know, literally the world can change in minutes, seemingly. But, you know, once this passes, if we get anywhere near where we were before this crisis occurred, we live in a very difficult employment marketplace. So getting employees to stay is usually pretty critical. That offboarding interview is a chance to gather all the company property. Again, we talked about things like badges, keys, company vehicle information, whatever we need to make sure that we're gathering from that employee, laptop, computers, any of those things need to be gathered that are company property, and this is the appropriate time to do that so that in this offboarding interview, we're actually getting all of that information. I think one of the number one things that we miss when an employee leaves is actually updating all of their relevant contact information. And obviously, we're going to talk about the importance of this in the exit interview process, but we also need this for a lot of other things, anywhere from how do we mail a W-2 to how do we get COBRA information out, how do we get a last paycheck out. There's a number of things where we need to make sure that we have a correct address, that we have a correct email address, that we have a correct phone number, contact information. So all of that is relevant information, and it's really good if we have a process in offboarding to gather the latest information that the employee has related to their contact information. It seems to just make so many things that much smoother after the fact if we've actually gathered that appropriate contact information. And then lastly, we want to communicate the process for an exit interview if in fact there is going to be an external exit interview that's going to happen after the fact. Then it's a great time to communicate that. We find that this very positively impacts response rates when they're aware of an exit interview that's going to occur. Then it makes them more likely to respond regardless of how that's being done, whether it's online or whether it's via phone. And again, these are all things that we'll talk about when we get to the exit interview process itself. But just communicating any additional things that might be occurring as an impact of them actually leaving the organization. So let's talk a little bit about the exit interview itself. And again, I think that when an employee is leaving, that when we talk about offboarding, that almost all of the offboarding conversation sort of gets lumped into this idea of the exit interview itself. And, you know, the purpose of the exit interview is really to reveal the true causes of why somebody leaves. We find that people want to learn insights about how they can improve retention. And so we have these objectives. We want to identify those real reasons. We want to accurately identify opportunities for improvement in the organization. We want to understand the key attitudes around workplace conditions. Those are all done to develop strategies to prevent future turnover. Again, prior to the last couple of weeks, we had seen turnover continue to go up over the last 6 or 8 years. It just seemed like there was no end in sight in terms of voluntary turnover continuing to move upward. There is an opportunity to uncover potential compliance issues. We can also ask things like where the employee is going to work and why they chose to go to work there and what actually attracted them to their new employer. And lastly, would they consider returning? This is a really important question to ask. We can get some really valuable information about what would need to be the circumstances in order for them to return to you as an employer. And so that is a really important question to ask in the exit interview process. So a couple of things that we know about, you know, kind of exit interviews and about the exit interview process. This data is a little bit dated. I didn't love the fact that I was going to bring this back up, but a number of years ago, we did a joint study with a company called the BLR, Business and Legal Review. They're now called Simplify Compliance, where we asked about 1,800 HR professionals to give us information about the exit interview and exit interview process. And just anecdotally from the conversations that I've had with HR professionals across the U.S., I think these numbers are still pretty accurate. But about 80% of organizations do exit interviews with at least some of the employees that leave. It's not necessarily every single one. There's a higher percentage, for example, exempt employees than non-exempt. But a vast majority of companies are actually trying to conduct an exit interview with at least some of the employees that leave the organization. Almost 90%, 89% are conducting the exit interviews because they want to identify improvement opportunities. So that's the real opportunity that they see in conducting an exit interview, is what can we learn that's going to help us improve overall. I find this fascinating over and over again, but 96% preferred the interviews to be completed by HR. I think we're putting an incredible amount of time and stress on HR departments right now for so many reasons, and now we're adding to this that we want them to complete the exit interview. I certainly would agree that I think HR, as opposed to the manager, is a good thing for them to do, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. But I'm surprised that HR, it seems like this is one of those things that they want to hoard, this responsibility of conducting this exit interview, maybe as opposed to potentially outsourcing it. Here's the number that you're going to find out in a few minutes that really is one that makes me nervous, and that's 89% of exit interviews are conducted on or before the last day of employment. And I'll get to the punchline on that one in a couple of minutes. Only 37% ask about compliance or ethics issues. It is a perfect time for employers to ask if there were any issues related to compliance or unethical behavior, but we find that less than half actually do that. And then a little concerning is that only a little over 15% actually review exit interview information with senior management. I think some of that has to do with the fact that when they're done with internally with HR, we simply don't have a good way to actually accumulate that data so that we've got a good way to review it with senior management. So that's a little bit about what we know about the overall exit interview process. You know, this is one of those things I just kind of wanted to throw in there, because when we think about the actual process of the exit interview, and again, we talk about that primary objective being wanting to figure out what we can do to overall improve as an organization. And one of the things that's really interesting is just how different companies are. Work Institute actually publishes an annual retention report. In fact, we're working on the 2020 version right now, expect it to be out by early to mid-April. Certainly that's what we're hoping, even though everyone is dealing with this crisis right now. But we did a study and we looked at about 175 companies, and we looked at the top 3 reasons why employees were leaving that organization. And we found that less than 8% of companies actually shared the same, what we call, turnover profile. So less than 8% actually have the same top 3 reasons in the same order for leaving. And we actually took that a little bit further, and we looked at the same company with different locations, and the same thing held true. So a lot of times I think if we're not conducting interviews, or if we are conducting them, we tend to think that that data is sort of applicable to every location or everybody. I know that if you look up best practices for employee retention, you're going to get probably about 10,000 Google hits, all of them with the secret sauce in order to how to retain employees effectively. But what we don't know is whether that actually applies to your organization. And that's why the exit interview is so critical, is we need to gather the information that's relevant to you. And I can tell you from working with so many companies over my time here at the Work Institute, is that there are so many different environments, there's so many different circumstances, different industries, different cultures, that the reasons why people leave are just so scattered and they're so different, and especially when you start looking at departments and locations. So we need to be able to figure out how are we going to use this data to help improve the organization. And if we're going to, then we have to have a really good process, and we have to have a really good way to access that data. And we have to understand that we're going to probably be different than our neighbor down the street, and that we're going to potentially have to do different things in order to improve as an organization. So we have a number of options in collecting feedback, and I don't know that this is the perfect way to visualize it, because there's probably more ways to think about this than just the 3 that are here. But one that's probably the most common outside of HR doing it is just an online survey. That online survey can be done via internal, so there are a lot of tools out there where HR has the ability to create their own surveys, whether it be like a SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or one of those type of tools that you just subscribe to, and then you're building your own surveys. But you have access to all of the data via that, and typically they're considered non-confidential. So there are online surveys that are being conducted what we would call internally. And of course, the number one thing that happens is that the HR department is conducting an exit interview. Again, this is where it tends to be, from our experience, a little less informal, or excuse me, a little less formal. There isn't always a guideline for specific questions that are going to be asked. Very seldom are we getting ratings around specific workplace drivers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they tend to just be kind of question and answer, and then it's difficult to then accumulate that data into a way to potentially trend it, review it, look at it from an overall company standpoint, And that's one of the disadvantages of doing it with HR. Now, I've talked to a ton of HR people. I do speaking across the country. I talk to a lot of SHRM chapters, HR groups. There just seems to be this desire on the part of the HR department that, one, they think that they're going to tell them the truth, and two, they just want to hear that information sort of firsthand. And I know the draw to that. I know that you want to feel like you're getting that information firsthand, but there's also a lot of challenges with that as we try and take that data and go to the next step. There tends to be some difficulties in terms of taking that data and actually doing something with it. So we'll talk more about that. And then the third potential option is to outsource it to a third party. Now, when you outsource it to a third party, you typically have various options. So you can go, again, to an online survey, but you've actually outsourced it to someone else in order to conduct those. And again, I'm going to make an important distinction here between, you know, a company just buying a survey tool versus literally outsourcing that entire process to a third party, where there can be confidentiality if it's warranted or wanted, but it just puts an additional layer of distance between the process of conducting the exit interview, and we're going to talk about why that might be important in a couple of minutes. But you can also outsource them to be done paper pencil, although very, very few are still doing that, and of course then telephonic exit interviews, which are still very much a part of the landscape today. The timing of interviews. So I mentioned earlier that 89% of exit interviews are actually conducted on or before the last day of employment. And that's typically where they're done. They're either done on that last day or they're done before the last day of employment. But they can also be done after employees are gone. So we really have to think about the timing of that, and it definitely matters in terms of how we get information and the authenticity. So we really got to think about how we do this. I think one of the major factors in deciding it is a lot of times related to response rates. Obviously, if you do that before or before the last day, on or before the last day, excuse me, then we clearly get high response rates, but there may be some downsides to that we need to think about in terms of the authenticity of the data. So this is sort of the options in terms of conducting the exit interview, and we'll get into a few more details about that. Here's, you know, when we think about the overall process of collection, I think we need to think about, again, the authenticity of the information that we're gathering. And this is where the collection method matters. And it depends, and again, the ability to outsource it versus bring it in matters. 40% of the reasons for leaving are actually going to change when they're conducted by an outside objective third party as opposed to internal. And I know everybody's going, are you kidding me? Well, I'm not. And I think that it's not a matter, I don't just think this, I know this. It's not a matter of the fact that employees are lying when it's done internally. I think that they're just smoothing over the truth a little bit. So it's amazing how many times, you know, you might hear personal reasons internally, but then once they actually leave, you find out that those personal reasons had to do with a teammate, they had to do with a manager, they had to do with some other issue, they were going to work for a competitor. There are so many things, and we literally see this in internal conducted exit interviews, the sheer number of times that personal reasons is that number one reason for leaving. And it's, you know, everybody can define what their own personal reasons are, and what we need to be able to do is to get beyond those personal reasons and get to what are those personal reasons so that we can, again, the objective is to improve the organization. And it's really hard to improve on a topic related to personal reasons. So we need to be able to get beyond that. So 40% of the reasons for leaving will change when done by an outside objective third party versus internal. So again, go back and think about that. 89% of exit interviews are done on or by HR. 96% prefer it to be done by HR, and yet the research tells us that that's not going to get us the most authentic information. And this just continues to blow my mind, that we continue to go through this process of collecting this information. And literally, when I'm doing speaking engagements, I'll ask, what does everybody think are the reasons why somebody might not be authentic in telling someone internally about their reasons? And they'll list them. They don't want to burn bridges. They don't want to say anything bad about a teammate. They don't want to say bad things about their manager. They haven't gotten their final paycheck. There's just this, they're not as objective. There's all these host of reasons why they might not feel comfortable being totally honest and authentic, and yet we continue to do them that way. So I think this is one of the major factors that we need to think about. And then here's the bigger one, is the timing. And again, I'm going to go back to that same list of things, that when you're still employed, it's a very difficult time to be as truthful as you would like about your employer. And I think we can almost all put ourselves in that situation and say, am I really going to say everything that I really want to say while I'm still an employee? I'm still sitting here in the offices. I'm still owed my final paycheck. You know, I still need a reference to come through. Whatever those reasons are, we find that 63% of the reasons for leaving will actually change if we conduct this exit interview 2 weeks after they've left. So timing matters. It matters significantly. Now, the counter argument for this always goes back to this idea of response rates. Well, we're only going to get 40, 50, 60% response rates when we're doing them after the employees leave. Well, that's probably true, and that's about our average, because we obviously do this for a lot of companies. We find that they can be as high as 70 or 80% when there's really good communication and everybody knows what the process looks like. But it can often be 45 to 55%. But would I rather have that response rate and know that my data is correct and that I've got authentic information, or would I rather have 100% response but not know what data to trust? And I think it gets back to how do I actually trust my data? So we really have to think about, are we going to do them internally versus externally? Are we going to, what is the timing of the exit interview going to be? And there's research to support what that answer needs to be. So if we think about best practices for exit interviews, and I know this is going to sound repetitive, but I want to talk a little bit about what that looks like. One, interviews are ideal. Surveys are okay, but it does limit the information we can get. External offers more authenticity after the employee left, gives us employees a chance to be more open and honest. The data should be organized to enable both ad hoc and periodic reviews, at least on a quarterly basis. And then actions should be developed in areas or jobs with higher costly turnover. So these are the best practices. So what is it about each of these best practices that's important? So let's talk a little bit about a survey versus an interview. So in a survey, typically we're limiting the extent of what we can learn. So we're typically going to get ratings only. We're going to get true-false responses. We're just going to get ratings. We're not going to get insights into those ratings. It limits the response. Whereas if we're doing an actual interview with qualitative questions that's more conversational and gives us the ability to probe, we can get more information from the departing employee. And let me give you a great example. So maybe we want to be able to figure out what's going on with our supervisors. So we might ask them to rate their supervisor. So their supervisor is rated as good. Okay, well, it's great that we know what's good, but what would it take to get to excellent? So what are the improvements that would need to be made? And go back to this idea that 89% of exit interviews are being conducted so that we can figure out how to improve the organization. Now, do I know what I can do to improve if I just know that my manager was rated as good? Not really. I don't know what they would need to do to get better. But if I ask the simple question of what would it take to get to excellent, suddenly I give the former employee an opportunity to tell me exactly what that manager could have and should have done in order to get an excellent rating. So that probing and that conversational tone, it's still structured. We call it a semi-structured behavioral interview, but it's a behavioral interview so that we can follow up with these qualitative responses and really understand what's driving employee perceptions in the organization. And we find that we did a study about how important these reasons were, and we did some predictive analytics, and we found that we could predict intent to stay, and this was on stay interviews, almost twice as accurately when we had these reasons in addition to just the ratings. So those reasons matter, and they just make things much more clear, and in the sense of doing a stay interview, it actually improved the predictability as well. Let's talk a little bit about, again, this internal versus external. Again, I want to go back to that 40% of the reasons for leaving will change. But I also want to talk about just the challenge of conducting exit interviews. And again, from the research that we see, a lot of times the reason exit interviews are not completed is simply because there isn't enough time. We can't fit it into the schedule. HR is overburdened. They've got too many fires they're trying to put out. There's just too much going on in order for them to make sure that they're conducting a high quality exit interview with every employee that leaves. And this is one of the reasons we end up using online tools. And again, those online tools can be very effective at gathering basic information, but they very seldom give us the kind of information that we really want and need in order to make the improvements that we're looking for. And by outsourcing to a third party, what you end up getting is a much more streamlined process, one that you can rely on, one that you know is going to be very structured. You know the same thing is going to be done on a repeated basis. And I know that the other thing that comes into play here is cost, because everybody looks at it and says, well, it's going to cost me X number of dollars to outsource this to a third party. But what we find is typically when we look at the time associated with conducting these exit interviews internally, and if we apply, say, an hourly rate to an HR person, we find that it's typically cheaper to do them externally as it is to do them internally, if we look at it from that perspective. So our HR people can either be doing more important things, doing the other things that need to be done in the organization, or simply we could maybe not have to have you know, that sixth HR business partner because we're taking a responsibility away that allows us to be more efficient. Again, I want to go back to the timing because the timing matters. We want to do these after the employee leaves. That's the critical time. Again, 63% of the reasons will change, so we want to make sure that we're doing the exit interview after they've left. It just makes things so much more efficient when we do it that way. So again, that's the timing that we need to have. And then, I just threw this out here, reporting. So we want to make sure that we've got organized before, sorry, I apologize, I hit the wrong button. This is just a typical thing that we might show a client, and it gives us the ability to quickly organize this information into a way that we can use this data to go and make the improvements that we're always talking about. So everything from what are the categories why people leave to what are those individual reasons why people leave, even some of the qualitative data can be reported very easily. And then around ratings, we can actually look at this trended over time, so we can see whether things are getting better, they're getting worse, what are those overall core drivers doing in terms of trend. So these are just easy things for us to be able to produce, and this is what one of the barriers we typically find when these are not being this data is not being presented to the senior leadership team, is because they don't have the easy way to accumulate this data into a meaningful report to provide to their senior leadership team. I know I've been talking a lot and I'm getting near the end, but I've also just realized it doesn't look like we've got any questions that are being answered. So I want to encourage you, we're about to get to the end here. So I want to make sure that if we have any questions that we actually get those answered, so feel free to submit those now. I want to wrap things up here, and I want to talk briefly about why, again, from an action standpoint, that exit interviews are important. And I think that, you know, one of the big things that's being talked about in business today, and certainly being talked about in HR, are predictive analytics. So we talk all the time about, you know, putting together predictive analytics. And I don't think people realize that an exit interview is actually a predictive analytic. The studies show that the reasons that people are leaving are actually the same, are similar reasons to why we have at-risk populations in our organization. So we find that if we act on the reasons why people left, that we find over and over again that we're able to improve overall turnover because there are other people that are feeling the same things. So there are predictive analytics, so we can use that data to actually change the outcomes in the future. And we have case studies that you can go onto our website and review that shows some actual case studies around that actually occurring. You know, one of the disappointing things is that in that same research we did a number of years ago, we found that less than 6% of companies felt that they were very effective in acting on the information that was collected during exit interviews. So, you know, even regardless of how they're being done, whether they're being done externally, whether they're being done internally, 89% say they're collecting this information in order to make improvements in the organization, and yet we find that less than 6% are actually using the data effectively to make those improvements in the organization. And oftentimes this is also where that outside third party can be helpful in terms of driving some discipline and accountability around how we use the data in order to make the improvements that need to be made in the organization. So it's just a really good way to make sure that we're using that time and that effort or those costs to actually use that data in terms of making improvements in our organization. All right, so again, unless there's a problem, and maybe there is, William, I know on our marketing team, I know is also listening in. I'm not seeing any open questions. Am I missing something? You can walk across the hall and let me know one way or the other. But really, I'd love to answer some questions at this point. Again, if your questions are not about the offboarding process, is there any other questions right now about remote workers or workplace issues that are happening right now with this ongoing crisis that I might be able to answer at this point? All right, we do have one answer. What about the knowledge transfer? Again, I want this kind of goes back to that process of transferring the information necessary and putting a person in charge of making sure that we have a good knowledge transfer at the point of an employee leaving and the new employee coming on board. Now, obviously, if somebody has been there for, say, 10 years, the ability to move all of that knowledge is almost impossible, but can we have them create maybe a transition document or something where the key things that they've learned over time are things that we can capture in some sort of a documentation so that it can be shared with the new employee. It's those sort of hidden issues around jobs that we've all experienced in going into new jobs. It's like, nobody told me I was going to have to do this, or nobody told me that this was the way you did this. There's those little funky things that you end up having to do to make a system work or to make a report work or do those things. So I think that's the really important part of the knowledge transfer. Well, I'm going to kind of wrap things up. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining today. Again, we're the Work Institute. One of the services we provide is to actually conduct exit interviews. We've done about 500,000 of those in our time as a company. We have incredible client retention rate. We work across a variety of industries. But we don't just do exit interviews. We do stay interviews. We do engagement studies. I hope that you can appreciate the fact that I was trying today not to present the Work Institute's approach, but to present the approach that the research tells us we need to do. So those things that I was talking about related to timing, related to external versus internal, those are not things, that's not research that the Work Institute did. Those were psychology students and professors that conducted that research to point out the things that need to be done in the exit interview process to make it the most authentic it could be. So I really appreciate everybody's time today. Again, our thoughts and prayers are with everyone as we continue to deal with this crisis across the U.S. and across the world. If there's anything that we can do here at the Work Institute to be helpful in terms of how do you make sure that your employees are feeling connected and a part of their community and they're getting all the communication they need, feel free to reach out to us. If you just need a friend to talk to, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, my name is Danny Nelms. I'm the president of the Work Institute. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on the website. Just simply call the office and ask for me. I'd be more than happy to spend some time talking to anyone that just has some questions or needs to just have somebody to talk to about this difficult situation. Again, thank you to everyone, and look for our next webinar, probably coming up in the next month or so, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.